This morning, the Bureau of Reclamation flagged a Colorado River operating signal. Lake Powell could fall below 3,490 feet by August, the minimum power pool level for Glen Canyon Dam. One signal would be unusual. Several signals together are harder to dismiss. According to Reclamation, the April 24-month study showed a minimum probable inflow near 2.78 million acre-feet, only 29% of the historical average. System storage across the Colorado River Basin was near 36% of capacity. The agency was preparing to cut annual releases from Lake Powell to Lake Mead from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6.0 million acre-feet, and water from Flaming Gorge was being moved downstream to keep Powell above a critical elevation. But that is not the most dangerous part. The headline is not only a falling reservoir. The hidden number is the release cut. This is not just a low reservoir. This is a release margin failure. It means the system is no longer only measuring water. It is rationing movement. So the question is no longer simply whether Lake Powell stays above power pool. The question is, what happens when lost runoff reaches the dam, the grid, the canal, the farm, the city, and the legal machinery of the river itself? Like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching from, because this map is not only showing a reservoir, it is showing where system risk may appear first. The first thing that changes in a river crisis is not the river, it is the dashboard. At the start of that operating morning, the Bureau of Reclamation was not describing a scenic lake in the desert. It was describing a machine under stress. The April 24-month study had turned Lake Powell from a blue shape on a map into a sequence of thresholds, forecasts, release tables, and emergency choices. One line pointed toward 3,490 feet. Another line pointed toward annual releases. Another pointed toward Flaming Gorge. Another pointed toward Lake Mead. Together, they did not behave like separate data points. They behaved like warning lights on the same control panel. By that morning, the official signal had already moved beyond one bad forecast. Reclamation had identified a minimum probable inflow into Lake Powell of about 2.78 million acre-feet for the water year. In plain terms, that meant the reservoir was not expected to receive anything close to its normal refill. The number was only 29% of the historical average. A lake that depends on spring runoff was being asked to operate after the mountains had failed to deliver enough water. That is where the day becomes abnormal. A reservoir can absorb a dry month. A basin can survive a disappointing snowpack. A dam can operate through low water if the rest of the system has margin. But when the runoff forecast collapses, storage is already low, power pool is within reach, and the release schedule has to be rewritten. The story is no longer about one dry season. It is about a river system losing room to maneuver. At first, the map seems simple. Lake Powell sits behind Glen Canyon Dam in northern Arizona and southern Utah. Lake Mead sits downstream behind Hoover Dam. Between them is the central operating spine of the lower Colorado River system, the section that turns mountain snow into stored water, power generation, municipal supply, irrigation deliveries, tribal water concerns, recreation economies, and legal obligations. But the map is misleading because it looks still. The system is not still. It is always moving water through time. That is the first hidden fact of the day. Lake Powell is not just a lake, it is a calendar. Water that falls as snow in the upper basin is supposed to become runoff in spring and early summer. That runoff is supposed to enter tributaries, then the Mainstem River, then Lake Powell. Powell is supposed to store enough of it to generate hydropower at Glen Canyon Dam and release enough downstream to Lake Mead. Mead is supposed to help serve the lower basin and Mexico under a set of rules, agreements, shortage tiers, and operating guidelines. Each step depends on the previous step, arriving close enough to expectation. But on this operating day, expectation was the problem. According to Reclamation, Colorado River system storage was around 36% of capacity. That number does not sound dramatic until it is placed beside the rest of the dashboard. 36% is not just a storage statistic, it is the amount of cushion left after years of drought, heat, evaporation, heavy demand, and incomplete recovery. It is the space available between a bad runoff year and a difficult operational decision. It is the room left for error. Then the next signal appeared. Lake Powell could fall below 3,490 feet by August without major intervention. That elevation is known as minimum power pool for Glen Canyon Dam. Below that level, the dam can no longer reliably send water through the turbines that generate hydropower. The dam may still release water through other outlet works, but the operating world changes. Power production changes, release capacity changes, risk changes. The dam is still standing, but one of its main functions is compromised. That is why the number 3,490 is not just a measurement, it is a switch. Above it, the system still has one kind of control. Below it, the system enters a narrower operating lane. The difference is not cosmetic. It changes how water can move, how power can be produced, how downstream deliveries are protected, and how much stress shifts from one reservoir to another. By the time Reclamation described the release response, the dashboard had moved from observation to action. The annual release from Lake Powell to Lake Mead was being reduced from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6.0 million acre-feet. That cut matters because it reveals the real signal. The system was not merely watching the reservoir fall. It was changing the movement of water to keep the reservoir above a critical line. This is not just a low reservoir. This is a release margin failure. The map shows Powell, but the system is failing at the release decision. A person watching from outside might ask a simple question. Why not just release the normal amount and wait for the next winter? The answer is that the Colorado River does not operate on hope. It operates on rules, forecasts, stored volume, legal commitments, power constraints, and physical infrastructure. If Powell drops too low, the damage is not limited to the lake. It travels into the dam, into downstream planning, into Lake Mead, into hydropower contracts, and into the confidence that the operating rules can still handle the river they were built to manage. This is why the day has the feel of a control room. Every agency signal points to another dependency. The Bureau of Reclamation provides the operating studies and reservoir projections. The Colorado Basin River Forecast Center watches snowpack and runoff behavior across the mountains that feed the basin. The Upper Colorado River Commission becomes involved because upstream reservoirs, like Flaming Gorge, can be used to move additional water toward Powell under drought response operations. State water agencies watch the same numbers because every foot of elevation can affect negotiations, shortage planning, and future rules. Power customers watch because Glen Canyon Dam is not only concrete and water, it is generation capacity in the western grid. On their own, these signals could be treated separately. Together, they describe one larger configuration. First, the runoff forecast had weakened. Second, the reservoir was projected near a critical hydropower threshold. Third, annual releases were being reduced. Fourth, water from Flaming Gorge was being moved downstream. Fifth, Lake Mead remained connected to whatever Powell did next. A single dry year can be local. This was not local. This was the whole river machine trying to protect one of its most important moving parts. And the strange thing is that the visible landscape can hide the crisis. Lake Powell is enormous. Its canyons stretch across a desert landscape that can make even a shrinking reservoir look vast. From a distance, water is still there. Boats may still move. Sunlight still hits the surface. Cliffs still rise above the lake. The human eye sees presence. The operating system sees elevation. That difference matters. A lake can look full enough to a visitor and still be too low for a turbine intake. A river can still be flowing and still be failing its delivery pattern. A reservoir can still hold millions of acre-feet and still be too close to a threshold that changes the rules of the dam. This is the part that makes water crises difficult to understand. The danger is not always the disappearance of water. Sometimes, the danger is water sitting in the wrong place, at the wrong height, at the wrong time, behind infrastructure that requires a specific operating range. That is what was abnormal about the day. It was not only that Powell was low, it was that Powell was low in a way that forced decisions upstream and downstream at the same time. The official response showed the shape of that pressure. Reducing releases helps keep more water in Lake Powell. Moving water from Flaming Gorge helps add support from upstream storage. But neither action creates new water. They move risk. They buy elevation. They protect one threshold by changing the balance elsewhere. That is the quiet tension behind the release cut. If Powell releases less water to Mead, then Powell gains breathing room. But Mead receives less than it otherwise would. If Flaming Gorge sends water toward Powell, Powell gains support. But Flaming Gorge loses storage it might need for its own future conditions, recreation, local economies, ecological concerns, and later drought response. If Glen Canyon Dam stays above power pool, hydropower is protected for now. But the fact that protection is required tells us the system is already in a narrow corridor. This is what a strained system looks like before a dramatic failure, not collapse, adjustment. A number is revised. A release is reduced. A reservoir is asked to help another reservoir. A forecast moves from uncomfortable to operationally dangerous. A study that once felt technical becomes a public warning. The language stays calm because agencies speak in measured terms, but the machinery underneath the language is tense. By mid-year, the most important question was no longer whether the basin had experienced drought before. It had. The question was whether the old sequence still worked. Snow accumulates. Snow melts. Runoff arrives. Powell refills. Powell releases. Mead stabilizes. Cities plan. Farms irrigate. Power is generated. Negotiators argue inside a known envelope. That sequence depends on recovery time. It depends on wet years showing up often enough to rebuild storage after dry years take it away. But the dashboard was showing something more dangerous than one missing refill. It was showing that recovery itself had become unreliable. That is why a number like 29% of average inflow is so powerful. It does not only describe what is missing from the lake, it describes what is missing from the calendar. The river expected a spring contribution that did not arrive at the scale needed. The reservoir expected refill pressure that was too weak. The operating plan expected enough cushion to keep normal releases moving. Instead, the system had to defend a threshold. And once a system begins defending thresholds, every next forecast matters more. A few feet of elevation can become a policy question. A dry month can become a power question. A runoff update can become a negotiation signal. A release schedule can become a warning to cities and irrigation districts that the basin is not simply dry, but constrained. There is also a human reason the dashboard matters. People do not experience a 24-month study as a PDF. They experience it later, after the numbers move through institutions. A water manager sees it in allocation planning. A utility sees it in generation expectations. A farmer sees it in uncertainty around deliveries and costs. A city sees it in conservation, messaging, and long-term supply planning. A tribal government sees it in unresolved rights and infrastructure gaps, colliding with a shrinking river. A household sees it only after the system has already made decisions far upstream. That is the delay that makes the warning so important. The official signal appears first in data. The public consequence appears later in bills, restrictions, fields, power portfolios, and political conflict. By the time the impact is visible at street level, the river has already been moving through the machinery for months. This is why the release cut is the signal. It is early enough to show stress before the public sees a single dramatic moment. It tells us the operating agencies are no longer only projecting a shortage. They are actively reshaping the river's movement to avoid a worse threshold. But the question remains unresolved. How many times can a system buy time this way before time itself becomes the scarce resource? A river basin can move water between reservoirs. It can change release patterns. It can conserve. It can negotiate. It can trigger drought response operations. It can update guidelines. But it cannot command snow to fall. It cannot order spring runoff to arrive. It cannot make old assumptions true by writing them into an operating table. That is why this day matters. The dashboard did not show one red light. It showed a configuration: low storage, weak inflow, a power pool threshold, a release cut, upstream support, downstream consequences. And behind all of it, an old river calendar being tested by a hotter, drier, less predictable basin. The day began with a number on an official study, but the number was not the whole story. The real story was the movement around it. Water held back. Water moved from upstream, releases reduced, power protected. Mead affected, rules tested. The reservoir was not simply falling, the operating system was tightening. And to understand why that tightening is so dangerous, we have to look closer at the headline number itself, because 3,490 feet is not just an elevation on a chart. It is the line where a reservoir becomes a power problem. The number sounds too clean to be dangerous until you realize what it controls. 3,490 feet is not just an elevation on a reservoir chart. It is the minimum power pool level for Glen Canyon Dam, the line where Lake Powell stops being only a storage problem and becomes a power problem. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, the April 24-month study projected that Lake Powell could fall below that elevation by August without major intervention. That is the headline number. But to understand why it matters, we have to remove it from the chart and put it back inside the machinery. A reservoir elevation is not like the height of water in a glass. A glass only needs to hold liquid. Lake Powell has to hold liquid at the right height, behind the right structure, with enough pressure to push water through the right openings at the right time. That is what makes 3,490 feet different from a normal low water mark. It is not the point where the lake disappears. It is the point where a major function of the dam begins to disappear. And that is why the number has to be treated like an operating threshold, not a scenery measurement. The number is not just water. It is pressure, timing, gravity, machinery, contracts, and downstream expectation being pulled out of position. To a visitor standing on the rim, the lake can still look enormous. There can still be blue water between canyon walls. There can still be sunlight on the surface, boats in the distance, and cliffs rising above the reservoir like nothing immediate is broken. But the dam does not see the lake the way a visitor does. The dam sees elevation. It sees whether the water surface is high enough to feed the penstocks, the giant pipes that carry water into turbines. It sees whether gravity can still do the work the whole structure was built around. It sees whether stored water is sitting high enough to become hydropower before it becomes downstream flow. That is the first shock hidden inside the headline number. Lake Powell does not have to be empty for Glen Canyon Dam to lose one of its most important functions. It only has to fall below the wrong line. 3,490 feet is about 1,063 meters above sea level. That conversion may sound technical, but it helps reveal the scale. We are not talking about a puddle, a canal, or a small-town reservoir. We are talking about a vast engineered basin where a difference of feet can represent huge volumes of water and enormous operating consequences. In a bathtub, a few feet means the difference between full and empty. In Lake Powell, a few feet can mean the difference between a turbine system that can operate and a dam forced into a narrower release pathway. The headline is elevation. The real story is control. Above minimum power pool, water can move through the hydropower system. Below it, the system has to rely on other outlets, and the operating room gets smaller. That does not mean the dam vanishes. It does not mean the river stops. It means the system loses flexibility. At the exact moment, flexibility matters most. And this is why the number feels abnormal in the middle of the year. Summer is not just a season on the calendar for the Colorado River. It is a demand season. Heat rises. Cities use more electricity. Landscapes dry. Irrigation remains critical. Reservoir evaporation intensifies. Recreation economies depend on access. The grid faces higher cooling load. Farms and cities watch deliveries. And into that season, the official projection places Lake Powell near a threshold that was never supposed to become ordinary. The number is not simply low. It is low at the wrong time, after weak runoff, with storage already depleted, while the system is trying to move water through a basin built on long-term expectation. That is the second shock. 3,490 feet is not only a physical line, it is a calendar line. If Powell approaches it by August, the danger is not just that water is low. The danger is that the reservoir has failed to rebuild before the hottest, most demanding part of the year has fully played out. A healthy reservoir system uses wet seasons to create margin before dry seasons spend it. But when runoff is too weak, the system enters the spending season without enough savings. That is what the headline number represents. It is a bank balance before the bills arrive. It is a battery level before the grid is stressed. It is a hospital bed count before the surge. It is not the disaster itself. It is the loss of buffer before the next load. The strange part is that the number can be hard to feel. 3,490 feet does not sound like a human crisis. It sounds like survey language, but the Colorado River is a civilization-scale delivery system, and its most important warnings often arrive in units that do not sound emotional. Acre-feet, elevation, release volume, percent of average. These are dry terms for wet consequences. An acre-foot is the amount of water needed to cover 1 acre of land 1 foot deep. Millions of acre-feet are not just big numbers. They are cities, fields, power contracts, treatment plants, lawns, orchards, tribal communities, reservoirs, and river ecosystems translated into operating units. Elevation is the same kind of language. It sounds abstract until it decides whether water can reach the machinery. So when Reclamation says Powell could fall below minimum power pool, it is not describing a distant visual change. It is describing a possible change in how the dam can function. The visible surface becomes an engineering question. The engineering question becomes an energy question. The energy question becomes a water management question. And the water management question becomes a political question, because every choice affects someone downstream or upstream. This is the moment when a number stops being a number. It becomes a dispute over who absorbs the shortage first. There is another reason the threshold matters. Hydropower is not only electricity, it is adjustable electricity. A dam can often increase or decrease generation in response to demand, making hydropower valuable in a grid that has to balance load constantly. When water levels drop, that value weakens. The dam may generate less power. It may lose efficiency. If water falls too low, generation can stop. And when generation declines, utilities must replace that power from somewhere else. That replacement can cost money. It can change emissions. It can tighten grid margins during heat. It can shift a reservoir problem into household bills and power planning meetings far away from the canyon walls. The lake looks remote. The consequences are not remote. That is why the number should feel heavier than it looks. A falling reservoir does not stay inside the reservoir. It travels through wires, contracts, canals, pumping schedules, irrigation decisions, and city planning. The headline number is where that travel begins to become visible. But there is a trap here. People may hear minimum power pool and imagine a sudden cliff, as if everything is fine one day and impossible the next. Real infrastructure usually does not fail that simply. It degrades through narrowing options. Before a threshold is crossed, agencies adjust releases. They move water from upstream reservoirs. They conserve. They change operating assumptions. They prepare for lower generation. They issue studies. They negotiate. They try to prevent a hard crossing by changing everything around it. That is exactly why the number matters before it is reached. The alarm is not only the crossing, the alarm is the behavior required to avoid the crossing. If a system has to cut releases and borrow water from upstream storage to protect a line, then the line is already shaping reality. The threshold has not just arrived in August, it has arrived early in the decision process. It is already forcing the river to be managed differently. This is not just a low reservoir, this is a release margin failure. The lake level is the visible face. The operating response is the deeper signal. The number 3,490 becomes even more important when placed beside the full pool number. Lake Powell's full pool is around 3,700 feet above sea level. That means minimum power pool is about 210 feet below full pool. To the ear, 210 feet can sound like a lot of room, but in reservoir operations, the issue is not whether some room remains above the intake or below the cliff. The issue is whether enough usable elevation remains to perform the tasks the system expects. A storage reservoir is not a bucket where every drop is equally useful. Water near the top has different operating value from water trapped below key outlets. The vertical position of water determines its usefulness. The same acre-foot can mean different things depending on where it sits. High enough, it can help generate power and support releases. Too low, it may still exist, but it no longer does the same work. That is the hidden violence of a reservoir threshold. The water may still be there, but the system can no longer use it in the same way. Out in the real world, this would not appear as one dramatic visual moment. It would appear as a chain of small adjustments. A power marketer would examine expected generation. A utility would look for replacement supply. A water manager would study release volumes. A city planner would watch conservation messaging. A farmer would ask whether next season's assumptions are still safe. A marina operator would worry about access. A tribal water office would see another stress layered onto long, unresolved infrastructure needs. A household might not notice anything at first. That delay is part of the danger. The number moves through institutions before it moves through daily life. By the time ordinary people feel it, the official dashboard has already been flashing for months. That is why a headline elevation must be translated into system feeling. 3,490 feet is a pressure warning. It is a delivery warning. It is a hydropower warning. It is a timing warning. It says the water is not only scarce, it is losing the height that gives it power. The dam was built around gravity. Gravity needs elevation. When the elevation falls, the river still flows, but the machine loses force. The system that once turned, stored mountain snow into controlled electricity and downstream release begins to operate with less authority. And the most unsettling part is that the number does not accuse one person, one city, one farm, or one dry month. It points to a compound condition: weak runoff, low storage, high demand, legal obligation, aging assumptions, a hotter basin, a reservoir near a mechanical threshold. Any one of these can be managed. Together, they make the number harder to dismiss. So when the official study names 3,490 feet, it is not asking the public to memorize an elevation. It is asking the system to confront what happens when the old operating range is no longer guaranteed. A reservoir can fall quietly. A threshold cannot. A threshold turns quiet decline into a decision. The map shows a lake dropping through canyon walls, but the system is being tested at the turbine, the release table, the power contract, and the downstream promise. And this is why the headline number is only the beginning. Because the most important signal is not simply how low Powell may fall, it is what the river managers are willing to change to keep it from falling there. That hidden number comes next. The number everyone sees is the lake level, but the number that changes the river is the release. That is the part most people miss. A reservoir can fall on a chart for months and still feel abstract, like a slow line moving across a screen. But when an agency begins changing the amount of water sent downstream, the crisis has entered the operating system. It is no longer only a question of how much water remains behind the dam. It is a question of how much water the system can afford to move without breaking another part of itself. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, the planned annual release from Lake Powell to Lake Mead was being reduced from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6.0 million acre-feet through September 2026. That difference, 1.48 million acre-feet, is the hidden number. It is not as visually dramatic as a reservoir dropping toward 3,490 feet. It does not create the same mental picture as exposed canyon walls or stranded boat ramps. But it is the number that tells you the system is defending itself. The visible number makes the headline. The hidden number writes the damage. To understand why, imagine the Colorado River not as a single river, but as a long mechanical promise. Snow is expected to fall in the mountains. Runoff is expected to reach Lake Powell. Powell is expected to release water to Lake Mead. Mead is expected to support cities, farms, tribes, industries, ecosystems, and international deliveries. Each reservoir is not only holding water, each reservoir is holding time for the next part of the system. A release is how that stored time moves downstream. When the release is cut, time is being withheld in one place, so a threshold can be protected in another. That is why the release cut is more revealing than the lake elevation alone. The lake level tells us Powell is under stress. The release cut tells us the stress is being transferred. This is not just a low reservoir. This is a release margin failure. It means the river managers are no longer operating only inside the old rhythm of refill and delivery. They are making a defensive move. They are choosing to keep more water in Powell, because letting that water move downstream on the old schedule could push the reservoir closer to a level where Glen Canyon Dam loses hydropower function. That is the lopsided pressure inside the decision. Holding water back helps Powell. But the water that stays in Powell does not arrive at Mead. The system gains elevation upstream and loses support downstream. Nothing in that transaction creates new water. It only changes where the shortage becomes visible first. This is why the hidden number feels colder than the headline number. The headline number says the lake could fall below power pool. The hidden number says the system is already changing behavior to prevent that fall. And a system that changes behavior before the public can feel the impact is telling us something important. The danger is not waiting for the threshold. The threshold is already reaching backward through the operating plan. It is already bending the release table. It is already affecting Lake Mead before Powell crosses the line. A person might ask why a release reduction of 1.48 million acre-feet matters so much when these reservoirs are already measured in millions of acre-feet. But an acre-foot is not a decorative unit. It is water with work attached to it. It can help move a field through a growing season. It can support municipal supply. It can influence reservoir elevation. It can pass through a dam and become electricity. Multiply that by more than 1 million, and the release cut becomes not just a conservation adjustment, but a continental scale shift in where water is allowed to be. 1.48 million acre-feet is a hidden wall placed in the river's schedule. Downstream, that missing volume does not arrive as a headline all at once. It arrives as lower elevation at Lake Mead, tighter hydropower expectations at Hoover Dam, more pressure on conservation, and more uncertainty for users who have already learned to read reservoir levels like financial statements. The river does not announce these changes with a siren. It announces them in accounting. This is where the story turns. The public sees scarcity as absence. The operating system sees scarcity as a conflict between functions. Do you protect Powell's power pool, or do you protect Mead's storage? Do you preserve hydropower at Glen Canyon, or do you maintain more downstream support? Do you move water from Flaming Gorge to help Powell, or preserve that upstream reservoir for its own future stress? Do you use today's remaining cushion to avoid an August threshold, or save it for the next dry year? These are not abstract policy questions. They are the machinery of shortage. The hidden number forces every part of the basin to admit that one reservoir's rescue can become another reservoir's burden. Reclamation's own description of the response makes that clear. The agency planned to add support to Lake Powell by moving water from Flaming Gorge Reservoir and by reducing releases from Powell. Together, those actions were expected to lift Powell's elevation by roughly 54 feet and keep it at least near 3,500 feet by April 2027. That sounds like relief, and in one sense it is. 54 feet can mean the difference between operating closer to danger and operating with more room. But the relief has a source. Flaming Gorge gives up storage. Mead receives less water from Powell than it otherwise would. Hoover Dam faces potential hydropower pressure. Recreation changes. Rafting flows change. Boating access changes. Fishing conditions change. The river's stress does not vanish. It migrates. That migration is the real story. A low reservoir is visible from space. A release cut is visible in the future. It appears later as a lower line at Mead, as a more difficult power forecast, as another conservation request, as another meeting between basin states, tribes, federal agencies, and water users. It appears as a system with less room to absorb the next surprise. This is how systemic risk moves. It does not always arrive as collapse. Often it arrives as a temporary fix that reveals how many other fixes are now required. The release cut is framed as protection, and it is protection. But it is also evidence that the old operating margin is too thin for the current hydrology. If Powell had received a strong runoff year, this decision might not be necessary. If system storage were high, this decision might be easier. If demand were lower, if heat were less intense, if the next winter were guaranteed, the release cut would mean something different. But placed beside weak inflow, record low snowpack, March heat, low basin storage, and the power pool threshold, it becomes part of a larger pattern. The hidden number does not stand alone. It locks into every other warning light. The strange part is that release cuts can sound responsible and alarming at the same time. That is because they are both. They are responsible because managers are trying to protect critical infrastructure before it crosses a dangerous operating line. They are alarming because protecting that line requires changing the river's movement in a way that affects other places. This is what responsible crisis management looks like when the crisis is already inside the system. It is calm language around a severe constraint. It is measured action taken because the alternative could be worse. But calm language should not be mistaken for a calm river. The operating decision is a sign that the river has lost slack. Slack is the invisible hero of infrastructure. Slack is the extra storage, the extra capacity, the extra time, the extra outlet, the extra wet year. The extra margin that keeps a mistake from becoming a failure. When slack exists, a dry year hurts, but does not dominate every decision. When slack disappears, every decision becomes connected to every other decision. A release from Powell becomes a Mead problem. A Mead decline becomes a Hoover power problem. A Hoover power problem becomes a grid and cost problem. An upstream transfer becomes a flaming gorge problem. A drought forecast becomes a negotiation problem. The hidden number is the measure of lost slack. It is water that cannot be moved without consequences. And this is where the human pathway begins to appear, even before we follow one person through the system. Because release cuts do not stay in agency documents. They travel. They move into planning offices where water managers revise assumptions. They move into power portfolios where utilities ask what generation can be counted on. They move into irrigation districts where growers wonder how much uncertainty can be carried into another season. They move into tribal communities where water rights may exist on paper, but infrastructure remains incomplete. They move into recreation businesses where a lower reservoir changes access, timing, and income. They move into city halls where conservation messaging has to be careful enough not to panic people and serious enough not to lie to them. The release cut is a policy number, but it becomes a lived number. The visible reservoir is outside. The damage begins inside the schedule. That is why the most dangerous part is not simply that Lake Powell may approach minimum power pool. It is that avoiding that threshold requires a chain of controlled sacrifices. Less water goes downstream. More pressure falls on Lake Mead. Upstream storage is asked to support Powell. Future options shrink. And every basin actor has to ask the same quiet question. If this is what it takes to get through this operating year, what happens if the next year does not repair the margin? That question cannot be answered with one forecast. It belongs to the future. But the release cut gives the first outline of the answer. It shows a river system where the old assumption that reservoirs can buffer dry years while deliveries continue on familiar tracks is no longer reliable enough to carry the whole plan. The system can still act. It can still move water. It can still protect thresholds. It can still coordinate. But each action now exposes a trade-off that used to be easier to hide. The river has become less like a full warehouse and more like an emergency room with too many patients and not enough beds. The doctors are still working. The system has not collapsed, but every decision tells you the room is full. That is the meaning of the hidden number. 7.48 becomes 6.0. A line on an operating table becomes a signal that the system is rationing movement. The lake level tells us where the water is. The release cut tells us what the water can no longer safely do. And to understand why the river has reached that point, we have to follow the mechanism backward, away from the dam, away from the release table, up into the mountains, the snowpack, the soil, the heat, and the runoff that failed to arrive with enough force. The mechanism begins long before the lake looks low. It begins above the reservoir, in the mountains, where the Colorado River Basin stores part of its future as snow. That is the first thing to understand. Lake Powell does not refill because a valve is opened. It refills because winter storms leave snow across high terrain, because that snow survives long enough into spring, because spring warming melts it at a useful pace, because the soil and vegetation do not take too much of it first, because tributaries carry it into the mainstem river, and because the river still has enough force to reach the reservoir as usable inflow. The name of the mechanism is runoff failure. It sounds simple, but it is not one failure. It is a chain. Snowpack can be too small, melt can come too early, soil can be too dry, air can be too warm. Evaporation and plant demand can take more water before it reaches a stream. The river can receive less water even when people remember seeing snow in the mountains. That is why runoff failure can feel confusing. The landscape may not look empty. The river still moves. The reservoir still contains water, but the annual delivery from mountain to lake has weakened, and the system that depends on that delivery begins to tighten. According to the Bureau of Reclamation, Lake Powell's water year minimum probable inflow was forecast near 2.78 million acre-feet, only 29% of the historical average. That number is not just a bad hydrology statistic. It is the mountain failing to pay the reservoir back. To see how that happens, follow one drop of water before it is water at all. In winter, it falls as snow somewhere high in the upper Colorado River Basin. It lands on a slope, among trees, rock, frozen ground, and old soil. In the old operating imagination, that snow waits. It becomes part of the seasonal bank account. The river system spends winter accumulating storage in the mountains, then spends spring and early summer moving that storage downhill. That rhythm is why reservoirs like Powell can exist as giant buffers. They were designed around the idea that mountain snow would arrive late enough and large enough to refill the system before the long dry demand season. But when the snowpack is weak, the first deposit is already too small. When warm periods arrive early, the snow can melt before the system is ready to capture its maximum value. When soils are dry from previous heat and drought, part of the meltwater disappears into the ground instead of running off quickly into streams. When vegetation wakes up and the atmosphere demands moisture, plants and air pull water from the landscape before it becomes river flow. The snow does not simply melt and enter Powell. It has to survive a gauntlet. That is the hidden root of the shortage. From atmosphere into snow, from snow into soil, from soil into tributaries, from tributaries into the river, from the river into Lake Powell, from Lake Powell into Glen Canyon Dam, from the dam into electricity and downstream release. By the time people see the reservoir surface falling, the mechanism has already passed through hundreds of miles of terrain and months of delayed consequences. That delay is what makes the system dangerous. The crisis does not begin when a boat ramp closes or a power pool threshold appears on a chart. It begins when the mountain water budget fails to convert into runoff. A snowstorm can look like relief in February and still produce disappointing inflow by June. A basin can have white peaks and still deliver weak water because snow depth is only part of the equation. The key is not just how much snow exists. The key is how much of it becomes river. That conversion is called runoff efficiency. In a cooler, wetter, more forgiving system, more of the mountain snowpack can become stream flow. In a hotter and drier system, the same snowpack can produce less runoff because the landscape takes a larger share before the river gets paid. This is where the mechanism becomes more unsettling. A reservoir operator cannot manage snow directly. They can manage releases, forecasts, storage, transfers, and contingency plans. But they cannot order the mountains to produce efficient runoff. If the water does not arrive, the whole operating table changes. That is exactly what the Lake Powell signal reveals. The visible line is lake elevation. The hidden mechanism is the failure of the basin to convert seasonal snow into enough usable inflow to protect power pool and maintain old release expectations at the same time. The number is not just low. It is late, misplaced, and insufficient. Imagine the Colorado River Basin as a long conveyor belt that begins in cold mountains and ends in desert demand. In a stable year, snow loads the belt. Melt starts the belt moving. Tributaries carry the product. Reservoirs receive it. Dams release it. Cities, farms, tribes, industries, ecosystems, and power customers plan around it. But if the belt is underloaded at the start, everything downstream waits for water that is not coming in the expected amount. The reservoir does not know whether the shortage began as low snow, hot March weather, dry soil, or high evaporative demand. It only knows the inflow is too weak. The dam does not know whether the missing water disappeared into the atmosphere, into vegetation, into groundwater recharge, or into a smaller stream pulse. It only knows the lake surface is falling toward a line that changes hydropower. The release table does not know the emotional story of the landscape. It only knows 7.48 million acre-feet has become difficult enough that 6.0 million acre-feet is now part of the response. This is not just a low reservoir. This is a release margin failure caused by runoff failure upstream. And once that mechanism reaches Powell, it stops being a mountain story. It becomes a dam story. Glen Canyon Dam was built to use elevation. Water high behind the dam carries potential energy because gravity can pull it downward through the system. The deeper and higher the stored water, the more useful pressure the dam can draw from. But as the reservoir falls, the relationship between water and machinery changes. The dam may still have water behind it, but not all water is equal. Water sitting too low loses some of the power that makes it operationally valuable. It may no longer reach the same intakes in the same way. It may no longer generate electricity with the same reliability. If the lake falls below minimum power pool, the turbines are no longer the dependable pathway for release. The system can still move water through other outlet works, but it has lost a major function. That is the moment the mechanism touches infrastructure. Snow failure becomes runoff failure. Runoff failure becomes reservoir decline. Reservoir decline becomes hydropower risk. Hydropower risk becomes release risk. Release risk becomes downstream uncertainty. This is how a dry mountain winter can enter a power market months later. It does not need a dramatic flood or a broken dam. It only needs the seasonal river machine to arrive underfilled. The mechanism also moves through time in a way people rarely feel. A dry winter does not immediately become a dry faucet in a city. The reservoir absorbs the delay. That is the job of storage. Storage hides the pain until it cannot. Powell and Mead were built, in part, to smooth out the difference between wet years and dry years. But storage only works when wet years refill enough of what dry years remove. If recovery becomes unreliable, storage stops being a permanent buffer and becomes a shrinking reserve. That is when the old calendar begins to fail. The operating calendar says, winter and spring build margin, summer spends margin, autumn resets the accounting. The drought calendar says every season may spend margin, and not every winter gives it back. That change is not philosophical. It appears in the lake elevation. It appears in the inflow forecast. It appears in the release cut. It appears in the decision to move water from Flaming Gorge toward Powell. It appears in the fear of falling below 3,490 feet by August. The mechanism has moved from climate into accounting. But there is one more layer. Heat does not only reduce snow or raise evaporation from reservoirs. Heat changes the thirst of the entire landscape. Warmer air can hold more water vapor, so it can pull more moisture from soil, plants, and open water when conditions allow. That means the basin does not simply receive precipitation, and pass it along. The basin consumes part of its own water before the river can use it. Dry soils act like a sponge at the worst possible moment. When snow melts across dry ground, the first water may refill soil deficits instead of running into streams. Vegetation also draws water as the growing season advances. Open reservoirs lose water to evaporation under hot, dry, windy conditions. Each process is normal by itself. Together, they can convert a weak snowpack into a much weaker runoff year. That is why a forecast like 29% of historical average is so alarming. It suggests the system is not merely short of water at the end, it has been losing water at several gates along the way. The gates are not always visible. A dry soil profile has no dramatic image from space. A warm spring day can feel pleasant to people in town. A smaller tributary pulse can look ordinary unless someone is watching the gauge. But each quiet change subtracts from the final number at Powell. The visible number arrives late. The hidden mechanism writes it early. This is also why the public argument about reservoirs can become misleading. Some people look at demand and say, the problem is use. Others look at drought and say the problem is supply. The operational truth is that both sides meet inside the same dam. A lower supply year becomes dangerous because demand and legal commitments are still attached to older expectations. A high demand system becomes more fragile because climate and hydrology are making the supply side less reliable. The mechanism does not care which argument is politically easier. It connects both. If inflow collapses and releases remain high, Powell falls faster. If releases are cut to protect Powell, Mead receives less water. If upstream reservoirs send support, they lose their own storage. If everyone waits for the next wet year, the whole system is betting that recovery will arrive on schedule. But runoff failure is precisely the warning that schedule can no longer be trusted. The map shows water levels. The mechanism is time being pulled apart. To make it concrete, picture the water moving through the system like a series of rooms. The first room is the mountain snowpack. If that room is understocked, the next room receives less. The second room is the soil and vegetation zone. If that room is dry and thirsty, it keeps more for itself. The third room is the tributary network. If the melt pulse is small or early, the streams send less toward the main river. The fourth room is Lake Powell. If the inflow is weak, the lake loses elevation while still facing release expectations. The fifth room is Glen Canyon Dam. If the lake falls too low, the dam loses hydropower function and must rely on narrower release options. The sixth room is Lake Mead. If Powell releases less, Mead's support weakens. The seventh room is the human system, where water managers, power buyers, farmers, tribes, cities, and households feel consequences that began as missing snow months earlier. That is the path. By the time the crisis reaches a person, it has already passed through atmosphere, terrain, infrastructure, law, and finance. And this is why the mechanism cannot be treated like a simple drought headline. Drought sounds like absence. Runoff failure is more specific. It is the failure of a seasonal process that a whole river civilization depends on. It is the failure of winter to become enough spring water. It is the failure of spring water to become enough reservoir elevation. It is the failure of reservoir elevation to maintain release and power functions at the same time. This does not require exaggeration. The official numbers already carry enough weight. A minimum probable inflow near 2.78 million acre-feet, 29% of historical average. A possible drop below minimum power pool. A release cut from 7.48 to 6.0 million acre-feet. Water moved from Flaming Gorge to support Powell. These are not isolated facts. They are the footprint of the mechanism. But the strangest part is that every stage still looks manageable from the outside. A forecaster updates a number. A reservoir operator changes a release. An upstream reservoir contributes water. A dam continues standing. A city continues functioning. A farmer continues planning. The system does not look broken. It looks busy. That is how infrastructure behaves when it is under stress. It keeps working by narrowing the choices available to everyone inside it. And the more choices it spends, the more fragile the next decision becomes. By the time Powell approaches a critical elevation, the physical event has already become a decision chain. The mechanism begins above the reservoir, in the cold, high basin. It moves through snow, soil, stream, reservoir, dam, grid, and delivery schedule. Then it reaches human beings not as a scientific diagram, but as a changed option. A release that does not arrive, a power source that becomes uncertain, a field that becomes harder to justify planting, a city plan that assumes more conservation, a negotiation that becomes sharper because the river has less slack. The lake is only where the mechanism becomes visible. The real movement began much earlier, and in the next step, that movement has to pass through one person, because no system failure is fully understood until it enters a body, a job, a household, or a decision that cannot be postponed. The river does not reach a person as a graph. It reaches as a decision that has to be made before the next morning. Follow one irrigation supervisor in the desert near Yuma, Arizona, before sunrise, when the air is still cooler than it will be by noon, and the fields are not yet shining with heat. He is not standing at Lake Powell. He cannot see Glen Canyon Dam. He is hundreds of miles from the reservoir that has become the headline. But the mechanism is already moving toward him. It began as weak mountain snow. It moved through dry soil, smaller tributaries, reduced inflow, falling reservoir elevation, and a release table that had to be cut from 7.48 million acre-feet to 6.0 million acre-feet. Now it arrives not as a wave, not as a broken canal, not as a dramatic announcement in the field, but as uncertainty. That is how system risk first enters daily life. It does not always enter through disaster. Sometimes it enters through a planning meeting, a pump schedule, a crop choice, a power bill, or a question no one can answer with confidence. The supervisor checks the day's irrigation plan. He knows the field does not care about a federal operating study. Lettuce, alfalfa, cotton, citrus, and winter vegetables do not respond to policy language. Soil moisture is physical. Heat is physical. A plant under stress is not waiting for negotiations between basin states. It is pulling water through roots, opening and closing tiny pores on its leaves, and trying to survive the balance between sunlight, temperature, and moisture. The body of the plant experiences the river as availability. The worker experiences the river as timing. Can water arrive when the field needs it, not merely sometime later, not only in an annual total, but at the hour and interval that prevents damage? That is where the release margin failure becomes human. The hidden number is not only 1.48 million acre-feet held back from the old release expectation. The hidden number becomes a smaller set of choices downstream. It becomes less certainty about how much storage will remain in Lake Mead. It becomes more attention to shortage tiers, conservation agreements, pumping costs, hydropower supply, and future delivery assumptions. It becomes the difference between planning a season with confidence and planning it with a question mark over every row. This is not a claim that one release cut at Powell instantly closes one field near Yuma. The Colorado River does not move through human life that simply. It moves through law, reservoirs, districts, contracts, return flows, canals, power systems, and political decisions before it reaches one person. But that is exactly why the signal is dangerous. The harm is delayed, translated, and distributed. By the time one person feels it, the system has already absorbed stress in 100 quieter places. The worker walks beside a canal that looks calm. That is the unsettling part. The canal can look normal, while the system behind it is being rearranged. Water may still be moving, gates may still open, pumps may still run. The field may still receive what it needs today. But the question has changed. The old question was how to manage water within a known season. The new question is how to manage a season when the storage system that makes the season possible is losing margin. In the distance, the sun comes up over an agricultural landscape built on precision. Rows must be irrigated at the right moment. Equipment must move at the right moment. Workers must arrive at the right moment. Harvest windows are narrow. Labor costs are real. Fuel costs are real. Refrigeration costs are real. Contracts are real. When water uncertainty rises, it does not stay inside a reservoir model. It enters every one of those decisions. The body does not experience a reservoir model as a graph. It experiences it as heat on skin, dust in the mouth, a longer workday, a field that cannot be mistimed, and a paycheck tied to a crop that depends on water arriving when the plant asks for it. The mechanism has moved from snow into muscle. The supervisor is not the only person in the chain. Somewhere else, a city water manager is reading the same operating signals with a different fear. A city does not need irrigation water in the same rhythm as a field, but it needs reliability. It needs treatment plants, pumping stations, storage tanks, conservation plans, and public trust. When a reservoir system loses margin, a city cannot wait until a tap runs dry to respond. It has to message conservation early, budget for new infrastructure, repair leaks, negotiate allocations, and prepare residents for a future that may not feel urgent yet. That delay creates a public communication problem. Say too little, and people think the crisis is fake because water still comes out of the faucet. Say too much, and people hear panic. The manager's job is to tell the truth before the truth becomes visible. That is one of the hardest jobs in a slow emergency. The field worker, the city manager, the tribal water office, the utility planner, and the household are all looking at different parts of the same mechanism. None of them controls the snowpack. None of them controls March heat. None of them can refill Powell by will. They inherit the result. And because the Colorado River is not only a natural river, but a legal and engineered river, the result reaches them as rules. That is what makes this human pathway different from a storm or a flash flood. A flash flood enters a street in minutes. A release margin failure enters life through institutions. It enters through revised operations, supply projections, power contracts, shortage declarations, conservation programs, and budgets. It can be less cinematic and more consequential. In one household, the river may arrive as an electric bill. Glen Canyon Dam's hydropower is part of the regional power system, and when reservoir elevation threatens generation, utilities and power customers have to think about replacement power. The household may never hear the term minimum power pool. It may never know the name of the penstock, the river outlet works, or the 24-month study. It may only see costs change slowly, or hear a public agency explain that hydropower output is weaker than expected. That is how a falling lake becomes a kitchen table issue. The water did not have to touch the house. The loss of margin traveled through the grid. In another household, the river may arrive as a conservation notice. A family in a desert suburb may be told to water less, remove turf, change landscaping, repair leaks, or accept higher rates for outdoor use. The family may ask why they are being asked to change when Lake Powell is far away. The answer is that distance is misleading. The Colorado River connects places that do not look connected. Snow in Colorado can become elevation in Utah and Arizona. Elevation at Powell can become release into Mead. Storage at Mead can become planning for Nevada, Arizona, California, Mexico, tribes, irrigation districts, and cities. A household lawn and a power turbine are not the same thing, but they are inside the same stressed basin. This is why the human pathway must be told carefully. It is not a story where one villain turns one valve and one person suffers the next day. It is a story where a system built for reliability begins delivering uncertainty instead. And uncertainty has a physical cost. The farm supervisor feels it when he wonders whether planting the same crop next season is responsible. A city feels it when long-term supply planning stops being routine. A utility feels it when hydropower becomes less dependable. A worker feels it when agricultural employment becomes more fragile. A tribal community feels it when promised water rights collide with the hard reality of pipes, pumps, funding, and a shrinking river. A household feels it when conservation stops being a slogan and becomes a monthly habit. The event is visible outside. The damage begins inside decisions. Now return to the worker near the field. The day warms. the soil surface dries faster. The irrigation timing matters more. A hotter basin does not only reduce river supply upstream, it increases demand downstream. Crops need water under heat. Cities need cooling under heat. Power demand rises under heat. Reservoir evaporation rises under heat. Workers face heat stress under heat, so the same atmospheric condition that weakens supply can also raise demand. That double pressure is what makes the pathway dangerous. A dry river might be manageable if demand fell at the same time. A hot demand season might be manageable if reservoirs were full. But when heat, low storage, weak runoff, and release cuts overlap, the human system receives load from more than one direction. The worker's body is part of that load. Heat changes how long someone can work safely. It changes water breaks, shade needs, medical risk, productivity, and the timing of outdoor labor. The river crisis is not only about water volume, it is also about the conditions under which people must work to move food, operate canals, repair pumps, drive trucks, and keep the desert economy functioning. The forecast shows hydrology. The body receives load. That is the line where climate becomes intimate. A person does not experience the Colorado River Basin as a basin. He experiences it as whether the shift can finish before dangerous heat, whether the pump runs when scheduled, whether the crop survives the week, whether the power bill rises, whether a manager delays hiring, whether next season's plan still makes sense. The scale is enormous, but the pressure becomes personal in small units of time. 1 hour, one irrigation turn, one field decision, one household bill. One meeting where a manager says the water outlook is less certain than before. The strange thing is that this kind of stress can look like normal work. The worker still gets in the truck, the canal still moves water, the city still opens offices, the dam still stands, the lights still turn on. But normal work under shrinking margin is not the same as normal work under stability. It requires more calculation, more contingency, more sacrifice, and more silence from people who do not have the luxury of stopping. That silence can make the crisis seem smaller than it is. There may be no dramatic image of the moment when a release cut reaches a person. There may only be a meeting, a revised budget, a delayed planting, a longer shift, a hotter room, or a choice not to expand because the water future no longer feels dependable. This is the human pathway of a release margin failure. From weak snow into weak runoff. From weak runoff into Powell. From Powell into a power pool warning. From the warning into a release cut. From the release cut into Mead's future elevation. From Mead into shortage planning. From shortage planning into farms, cities, power, tribes, and households. From those systems into bodies, jobs, and decisions. The path is long, but it is not abstract. It ends where people live. And once the mechanism reaches people, the next question becomes sharper. Where is the small part of the infrastructure that turns stress into failure? Not the whole river, not the whole dam, not the whole desert. The weak point is smaller than that, and that is why it matters. The weak point is not the whole river, and it is not the whole dam. The weak point is the narrow place where the lake must become controlled movement. At Glen Canyon Dam, that place is the connection between reservoir elevation, the turbine system, and the outlet works that remain available if the water drops too low. From far away, the dam looks like the strong part of the story. Concrete, canyon walls, steel gates, a vast reservoir pressing behind it. It looks permanent. It looks like the opposite of weakness. But infrastructure rarely breaks first at the place that looks dramatic. It breaks at the place where a design assumption meets a new operating reality. Here, the assumption is simple. Lake Powell needs to stay high enough for water to move through the power plant in the way the system expects. If the reservoir falls below 3,490 feet, the minimum power pool level, Glen Canyon Dam, can no longer generate hydropower through its turbines. According to Reclamation, below that level the dam's ability to release water is also reduced. That is the small component that changes the whole story. Not the lake surface, not the canyon view, not even the dam as a monument. The weak point is the working pathway inside the dam, Under normal conditions, the reservoir is not just stored water, it is stored height. Water sits high behind the dam, and gravity pulls it through massive intake structures and penstocks toward turbines. Those turbines convert the movement into electricity, and the water continues downstream. This is the elegant part of hydropower. The same water can generate power and then keep moving through the river system. It is not consumed by the turbine. It is delayed, guided, pressurized, and released. That means reservoir elevation does two jobs at once. It helps store water for downstream operations, and it creates the hydraulic head needed for generation. Hydraulic head is simply the useful height difference that gives water force. More useful height means more ability to push water through machinery. Less useful height means less force, less flexibility, and eventually no generation through the turbines at all. The word head sounds technical, but the image is simple. Hold a bucket high and water pours with force. Hold it low and the force weakens. Lake Powell is that bucket at continental scale. Glen Canyon Dam was designed around the height of that bucket. When the lake falls, the machine is not only receiving less water, it is receiving water with less power behind it. The danger is not only volume, it is usable position. That is why a lake can still contain millions of acre-feet and still be too low for a critical function. The water exists, but it is no longer sitting where the machinery needs it to sit. This is the part that makes the weak point so hard to see. The public imagines a water crisis as emptiness. Operators see it as access. Can the water reach the right intake? Can it move through the right pipe? Can it pass through the turbine? Can releases be made at the required volume and timing? Can downstream flow targets still be met? Can the dam respond to demand on the grid? Can the same structure still serve water delivery, power generation, river management, and environmental requirements together? The weak point is not whether the dam is strong. The weak point is whether the remaining water can still use the dam in the old way. That is where Lake Powell's elevation becomes an infrastructure test. Above minimum power pool, the dam still has access to the hydropower pathway. Below it, the system shifts toward the river outlet works, a different release pathway that was not meant to replace the full operating role of the power plant under ordinary conditions. Outlet works can move water, but they change the nature of control. They are not the same as having full turbine generation available. They do not carry the same power function. Their capacity depends on lake elevation, because lower water has less pressure behind it. And when the pressure drops, the operating envelope tightens. In a river system built on obligation, timing, and negotiated delivery, a tighter envelope is not a small detail. It is the difference between a system with options and a system that must choose which risk to move. This is why Reclamation's response matters. The agency was not only warning that Powell could fall below power pool, it was cutting releases and moving water from Flaming Gorge to prevent that outcome. Those actions show that the weak point was already shaping decisions before it was physically crossed. The outlet works did not have to become the only pathway for the system to feel the threat. The threat was already present in the operating table. Think of a hospital that has not run out of beds, but has started cancelling procedures to keep enough beds open for the emergency room. The cancellation is not the collapse. It is the sign that the system is protecting a critical threshold. Lake Powell's release cut is the river version of that. Normal release expectations are adjusted so the reservoir can stay higher. Water is held upstream so the dam can keep functioning. Another reservoir is asked to contribute support. The weak point is being protected because too much depends on it. And what depends on it is not only electricity. According to Reclamation, Glen Canyon Dam's power plant has produced an average of about 4 billion kilowatt-hours of hydroelectric power per year, enough to help supply the power needs of more than 350,000 homes. That is an easy number to repeat and a hard number to feel. 4 billion kilowatt-hours is not just power on paper, it is cooling in hot months, grid balancing, revenue for power customers, replacement costs when generation weakens, and a source of flexible electricity in a region where heat can push demand higher at the same time water supply is tightening. When Powell drops, the weak point reaches beyond the dam. The reservoir touches the grid. A hydropower reduction does not mean the lights instantly go out across the west. That would be too simple and too dramatic. The real consequence is more subtle. Utilities and power customers have to replace expected generation. Replacement power may cost more. It may come from other sources that are less flexible, more expensive, or more carbon-intensive, depending on market conditions. It can add pressure during summer when air conditioning demand rises. It can change budgets for public power customers. It can reduce revenues connected to dam operations and river programs. The dam still stands, the grid still operates, but a cheap, flexible, water-powered source becomes less dependable. That is how a weak point turns into a wider system problem. It does not have to fail completely to create damage. It only has to lose margin. The same is true for water releases. Downstream communities and institutions do not simply need water eventually. They need predictable release behavior. Lake Mead depends on what Powell sends. The Grand Canyon River corridor depends on flow patterns. Water managers depend on projections. Recreation and ecological systems are affected by the timing and magnitude of releases. If the power plant pathway is lost or constrained, and releases must rely more heavily on outlet works, the operating question changes from what should be released to what can be released safely and reliably under lower pressure. That is a profound change. It moves the system from preference to constraint. It narrows the difference between policy and physics. For decades, Colorado River management has often sounded like a legal argument. Who has a right to how much water? Which state takes a reduction? Which agreement governs which year? Which shortage tier applies? Those questions still matter. But the weak point at Glen Canyon Dam reminds everyone that law sits on top of hardware. A compact cannot make a turbine intake work below its operating range. A guideline cannot create hydraulic head. A negotiation cannot force a low reservoir to behave like a high one. The river is governed by documents, but it is delivered by gravity, concrete, steel, and elevation. When those physical conditions change, the legal system has to respond to a machine that is no longer offering the same choices. The weak point is where paper meets water, and paper is not enough. This is also why the smallness of the weak point is so important. Lake Powell is huge. The Colorado River basin spans a vast region. The law of the river is a century old and layered with treaties, compacts, court decisions, federal rules, tribal claims, shortage agreements, and state politics. But the immediate operational danger can concentrate at one elevation inside one dam. If the water surface falls below a certain height, a central power and release pathway changes. That is systemic risk in its pure form. A huge system can be forced to reorganize around a small physical bottleneck. The weak point is not the whole system. The weak point is the small component that forces the whole system to admit it has limits. Imagine the chain if that component weakens. First, Powell loses power generation capability at Glen Canyon Dam. Then expected hydropower has to be replaced or reduced. Then power customers face cost and planning consequences. At the same time, releases downstream become more constrained. Lake Mead receives less support, or receives it under more limited operating conditions. Lower basin planning becomes more tense. Hoover Dam's own hydropower and storage concerns stay connected to Mead's elevation. Conservation pressure rises, negotiations sharpen, recreation economies shift, ecological flow questions become harder. Local water supply concerns near the reservoir become more serious. The initial weak point is inside the dam. The consequence spreads through the basin. This is why the old visual vocabulary fails. People say the reservoir is low. That is true, but incomplete. People say the west is dry. Also true, but incomplete. People say drought is stressing the Colorado River. True again, but still incomplete. The sharper sentence is this: a low reservoir is pushing a major dam toward a narrower release architecture. That sentence is less familiar, but it explains the risk more clearly. It tells us exactly where the system is being tested. It tells us why release cuts matter. It tells us why upstream water is being moved. It tells us why the power pool line is not just a chart label. It tells us why the weak point is not dramatic from the outside, but dangerous from the inside. In normal times, infrastructure hides its dependence on thresholds. People do not think about the pressure inside a pipe until water stops arriving. They do not think about transformer temperature until power fails. They do not think about a bridge clearance until floodwater rises beneath it. They do not think about a hospital oxygen manifold until demand surges. The Colorado River version of that hidden dependency is reservoir elevation. Every foot is not equal. Some feet protect hydropower. Some feet protect release capacity. Some feet protect local water intakes. Some feet protect recreation access. Some feet are dead storage, present but not useful in the same way. The weak point becomes visible only when the system approaches the wrong foot. That is why the phrase minimum power pool should not be treated as jargon. It is a warning in disguise. Minimum means the system has reached the lower boundary for a major function. Power means the reservoir is connected to the grid. Not just the river. Pool means the lake itself is part of the machinery. Put together, the phrase tells a story. The water has fallen near the point where stored height stops producing power. That is not an environmental metaphor. It is an operating fact. And once that fact enters the system, every manager has to ask what happens next if the next runoff season does not repair the margin. The dam's weak point also exposes a deeper assumption about the entire basin. The Colorado River system was built around the idea that large reservoirs could convert variable hydrology into dependable service. Wet years would fill the bank. Dry years would draw from it. Dams would create control. But control depends on the bank being refilled. If weak runoff years arrive too often, if heat takes more water before it reaches the river, if demand remains high, then the control structure begins to behave less like a guarantee and more like a countdown. The reservoir still works, but each dry year spends more of the operating range. The weak point is the place where that spending becomes visible. It is where the old promise meets the new arithmetic. And there is a final reason this weak point matters. When a system loses one pathway, it does not only lose capacity, it loses resilience. Resilience is the ability to absorb surprise without forcing a crisis decision. A dam with full reservoir elevation, full turbine function, healthy downstream storage, and strong runoff can absorb a bad forecast. A dam near power pool, with reduced releases, upstream emergency support, and downstream stress, cannot absorb surprise in the same way. A mechanical issue, another hot spring, a lower runoff forecast, a legal delay, a demand spike, or a power market stress can have larger consequences because there is less room left. The weak point is not only what fails first, it is what makes every next stress more dangerous. So when we look at Glen Canyon Dam, we should not see only a massive structure holding back a shrinking lake. We should see a precision point inside a larger machine. We should see water trying to remain high enough to be useful. We should see turbines that need elevation, outlet works that become more important as options narrow, downstream users who depend on predictable releases, and a grid that has counted on hydropower from a reservoir whose refill is no longer reliable. The map shows a lake. The weak point is inside the dam, and history has already shown what happens when low reservoirs stop being exceptional and start becoming part of the operating pattern. This is not speculation. A version of this mechanism has already left evidence behind. The evidence is not a single photograph of a bathtub ring, not one stranded marina, not one dry year that people can dismiss as bad luck. It is a pattern written across the operating record of Lake Powell and the wider Southwest. According to Reclamation's Glen Canyon Dam water operations record, water year 2002 delivered only about 2.64 million acre-feet of unregulated inflow to Lake Powell, about 28% of average. Water year 2021 delivered about 3.50 million acre-feet, about 36% of average. The second driest year in that record, after 2002, Reclamation also notes that the period from 2000 through 2022 was the lowest 23-year period since the closure of Glen Canyon Dam in 1963. That is the precedent. Not one bad year, not one unlucky forecast. A long run of years in which the reservoir system repeatedly learned that recovery cannot be assumed. The current warning at Powell belongs to that history, but it is not identical to it. That distinction matters. History is not a script. It is a set of fingerprints. The fingerprint here is runoff failure traveling into reservoir operations. In 2002, the mountains failed to deliver enough water. Powell received a fraction of normal inflow. The system spent stored water to keep functioning. The reservoir absorbed the shock because large storage was still part of the basin's strength. But storage is not magic. It is memory. It remembers every year that does not refill it. A dry year does not vanish when the calendar changes. It leaves a lower starting point for the next year. And if the next wet period is not strong enough, the system carries the loss forward. That is what made the early 2000s so important. They showed that the Colorado River system could be pushed into a new kind of accounting, where the old assumption of regular recovery began to weaken. The reservoir did not fail in one dramatic moment. It adjusted, declined, responded, and continued operating, but the margin had been cut. That is how the precedent begins. Then came 2021, and the lesson returned with sharper edges. The system had already been living through a long drought period. Reservoir storage had already been reduced. The basin had already seen years of heat, low flows, and difficult negotiations. So when 2021 produced another extremely low inflow year at Powell, it did not land on a full system. It landed on a tired one. This is the difference between a single blow and repeated load. A healthy bridge may survive a heavy truck. A weakened bridge faces a different risk when heavy trucks keep coming before repairs are complete. The Colorado River's reservoirs are not bridges, but the logic is similar. They need recovery time. If dry years arrive before recovery is complete, the system becomes easier to push toward thresholds. That is why 2021 matters now. It showed that a very low runoff year can arrive after years of depletion and force the system closer to hard operating questions. The visible damage then was familiar. Lake levels dropped, boat ramps shifted, shorelines lengthened. Mead and Powell became national symbols of drought. But the deeper damage was operational. The river system began to treat shortage not as a rare emergency, but as a recurring management condition. In August 2021, the federal government made the first shortage declaration for Lake Mead under the operating guidelines, triggering reductions for the following year. That was not Lake Powell falling below power pool, and it was not the same event as the current warning. But it was part of the same family of evidence. Low runoff and depleted storage do not remain hydrology. They become rules. They become reduced deliveries. They become power concerns. They become negotiations. They become public messages from agencies that would rather speak in careful language than admit how narrow the room has become. This is the lesson of the precedent. The river does not have to stop flowing before the system changes. It only has to lose enough margin that the rules begin to bite. The same mechanism is visible in the research record. Researchers, writing in Nature Climate Change, found that the period from 2000 through 2021 was the driest 22-year period in southwestern North America since at least the year 800. Drought.gov, summarizing that research, points to the same long dry signal and explains that warmer temperatures intensify dryness by increasing evaporation and drying soil and vegetation. This matters because it links the operational history of Powell to the physical history of the landscape. The reservoir did not decline in isolation. It declined inside a region where long-term drought, heat, soil moisture loss, and runoff stress were already reshaping the water balance. That does not mean every dry year has one simple cause. It does not mean one study explains every reservoir movement. But it does mean the current warning is not floating alone. It is part of a documented background in which the Southwest has been running a long experiment with less water, more heat, and a system built for a wetter assumption. The precedent is not just drought. The precedent is what drought does when it reaches infrastructure. In the old public imagination, drought is a dry landscape, brown hills, empty washes, dust, a cracked field. Those images are real, but they are incomplete. In the Colorado River system, drought also appears as a reservoir operation. It appears as a release tier. It appears as a shortage declaration. It appears as a hydropower forecast. It appears as a legal meeting. It appears as a change in who must conserve, who must pay, who must wait, and who must accept less certainty. That is why the past matters. 2002 showed what happens when inflow collapses. 2021 showed what happens when another severe inflow year lands on a basin already weakened by prolonged drought. The years after that showed that one wet year can help, but may not erase a long deficit. A single good year can raise reservoirs, improve snowpack morale, and reduce immediate panic. But one wet year does not automatically rebuild a system that has spent decades drawing down its bank account. That is the mistake history warns against. People see a wet winter and assume the crisis is over. The reservoir sees math, the river sees cumulative storage, the dam sees elevation, the law sees obligations, the grid sees generation. The next dry year sees whatever margin remains. This is where the current Lake Powell warning echoes the past without copying it. The numbers are different. The operating rules have changed. Drought response agreements exist that did not exist in the same form before. Conservation has expanded. Agencies have more experience managing severe shortage. Forecasting has improved. Basin states, tribes, Mexico, federal agencies, power customers, and water users are more aware of the risk than they were at the start of the century. Those differences matter. They are reasons not to treat history as destiny. But the similarity is still severe. The mechanism is the same kind of mechanism. Weak runoff enters Powell. Powell loses elevation. The dam approaches a threshold. Operators change releases. Upstream storage is asked to help. Downstream users watch Mead. Power planners watch generation. Negotiators watch the calendar. The chain is familiar because the basin has been rehearsing pieces of it for years. The uncomfortable question is whether rehearsal has produced enough adaptation or only better crisis management. A system can get very good at avoiding the worst outcome and still be moving toward a harder future. That is another lesson of precedent. Success in one year can hide fragility in the next. If managers keep Powell above minimum power pool by cutting releases and moving water from Flaming Gorge, that is a real operational achievement. It protects power generation and reduces the chance of an immediate threshold crossing. But it also proves the system had to spend other options to get there. In past drought years, storage carried the system. In current drought years, emergency operations increasingly carry the system. Those are not the same thing. Storage is passive strength. Emergency operations are active strain. They require decisions, trade-offs, and political acceptance. They can work, but they reveal that the old cushion has thinned. The precedent also teaches humility. It would be wrong to say that because 2002 was extremely dry, the current year must behave exactly like 2002. It would be wrong to say that because 2021 was severe, every future year will be the same or worse. Hydrology is variable. The Colorado River can still have wet years. Snowpack can surprise forecasters. Monsoon patterns can affect parts of the basin. Conservation can reduce demand. Policy can change. Infrastructure can adapt. But it would also be wrong to ignore the evidence because one future year might be wet. The system is not threatened by dry years alone. It is threatened by dry years arriving when storage is already low and demand remains attached to old expectations. That is the condition the precedent reveals. The danger is not one drought. The danger is drought repeated over time until the reservoir system no longer has the same recovery room. This is why the past should not be used to frighten people. It should be used to locate the weak logic in the present. The weak logic is the belief that a reservoir system can always borrow from the future and be paid back later. For much of the 20th century, that belief seemed to work because storage was large. The basin still had unused legal and physical margin in some places, and the climate record used for planning appeared more stable than it was. But the last several decades have exposed the risk of that belief. The river can borrow from storage. It cannot borrow indefinitely from a climate that is changing the repayment schedule. A reservoir can carry shortage for a while. It cannot make low runoff irrelevant. A dam can manage water with great precision. It cannot generate hydraulic head from a lake that has dropped below the necessary elevation. The precedent does not say collapse is inevitable. It says the system has already shown how stress moves. First, as poor runoff, then as lower storage, then as modified operations, then as shortage rules, then as power and delivery questions, then as political urgency, then as the need for a new operating model. That path has already been walked. The current warning at Powell is alarming because it places the system farther down the same path, near a threshold where hydropower and release capacity become harder to protect. When Reclamation talks about keeping Powell above power pool, it is not inventing a new fear. It is responding to a mechanism with a record. When researchers describe a historic megadrought, they are not saying every reservoir movement has a single cause. They are describing the climate background that makes low storage harder to recover from. When water managers cut releases, they are not simply making a bureaucratic adjustment. They are acting inside a history that has already shown what low runoff can do. The past is not a prophecy. It is a warning label. It tells us that the visible reservoir decline is only one stage of a longer process. It tells us that a dry year can echo for years if recovery does not arrive with enough force. It tells us that emergency actions can protect thresholds while also moving stress across the system. It tells us that the river's future will not be decided only by the next snowpack map, but by whether the whole basin can stop treating old storage as an endless shock absorber. And that leads to the larger pattern. Because if this were only about Lake Powell in 1 year, the story would end at the dam. It does not. The release cut points beyond the dam, beyond one reservoir, and into a bigger question about whether the Colorado River's old calendar still works in a hotter and more crowded century. The Lake Powell warning is not only a reservoir story, it is a calendar story, and the calendar is beginning to fail in more than one place at once. For most of the modern Colorado River system, the operating imagination was built around a sequence that sounded stable enough to become invisible. Winter would store water in the mountains. Spring would convert that snow into runoff. Summer would spend part of the reservoir bank. Dams would smooth the difference between wet and dry years. Legal rules would organize deliveries. Power plants would turn elevation into electricity. Cities and farms would plan around a river that varied, but still returned often enough to something like balance. That was the old rhythm. The current Powell signal says the rhythm can no longer be taken for granted. This is not only a reservoir event, it is a calendar failure inside a legal and hydraulic machine. The first calendar failure is physical. The river's old year was built around snow becoming runoff at the right time. But weak snowpack, warmer spring conditions, dry soils, and higher atmospheric demand can reduce the amount of water that actually reaches the river. When that happens, the reservoir calendar breaks. Powell does not refill enough before summer demand rises. Storage does not recover enough before the next operating year begins. Hydropower does not sit on the same secure elevation. Release schedules stop feeling routine. A forecast update becomes a management crisis because there is not enough buffer between a bad inflow year and a hard threshold. The river still has seasons, but the seasons no longer perform the same work. The second calendar failure is legal. The current operating guidelines for the major Colorado River reservoirs were designed for a defined period, and they are set to be replaced for the post-2026 era. Reclamation has been moving through the process of developing new post-2026 operational guidelines for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. That timing matters because the physical river is tightening at the same moment the rule system is being rewritten. This is not a small administrative transition. It is a collision between hydrology and governance. The old rules are reaching their expiration date, while the reservoirs are warning that the old assumptions may already be expired in practice. That is why the Powell release cut carries a meaning larger than the current year. It is not just one emergency adjustment, it is a preview of the question every post-2026 rule must face. How should the system operate when the reservoirs cannot be assumed to recover on the schedule that older agreements quietly depended on? If Powell must be protected from minimum power pool by reducing releases, then future rules cannot treat power pool as a distant edge case. If Mead loses support when Powell is protected, then future rules cannot treat the two reservoirs as separate political symbols. If Flaming Gorge must help Powell, then future rules cannot pretend upstream storage is isolated from downstream risk. The system is connected by water, but it is also connected by sacrifice. This is the pattern. A dry signal appears in the mountains. It becomes weak inflow at Powell. It becomes a power pool warning at Glen Canyon Dam. It becomes a release reduction toward Mead. It becomes a storage concern at Mead. It becomes a shortage question for the lower basin. It becomes a power question for hydropower customers. It becomes a policy question for federal agencies, basin states, tribes, Mexico, irrigation districts, cities, and utilities. The original problem is water. The system pattern is interdependence. The old calendar assumed that reservoirs could convert climate variability into manageable operations. That assumption was never perfect, but it was powerful. It allowed cities to grow, fields to expand, power contracts to form, and legal structures to harden around expected deliveries. But when the basin becomes hotter and runoff becomes less reliable, the reservoir stops being only a stabilizer. It becomes a warning recorder. Every low year is written into elevation. Every missed recovery is carried into the next season. Every emergency operation spends an option that might be needed again. The reservoir is no longer just smoothing variability. It is documenting the loss of margin. That is why this is a new baseline question. A new baseline does not mean every year will be dry. It does not mean wet years vanish. It means the system cannot safely plan, as if the old average will rescue every deficit in time. A wet year can still come. A strong snowpack can still raise hope. Conservation can still help. New rules can still reduce risk. But the baseline changes when the system must treat recovery as uncertain rather than automatic. That is the shift. The old question was how to divide a river that was overpromised. The new question is how to operate a river whose recovery schedule is no longer dependable. This is where infrastructure and climate become one story. A hotter basin changes snow, soil, evaporation, plant demand, and runoff efficiency. Infrastructure receives those changes as lower reservoir elevations, reduced hydropower output, narrower release options, and harder trade-offs between storage and delivery. Society receives those changes as costs, uncertainty, conservation demands, legal conflict, and planning stress. None of these layers can be solved alone. A dam cannot solve snowpack. A conservation program cannot solve turbine elevation by itself. A legal agreement cannot make missing water appear. A wet winter cannot erase a structural imbalance if demand and rules still assume more water than the system can reliably provide. The pattern is compound. Each layer makes the next layer harder. That is why the system reaction can feel overloaded even when nothing has collapsed. Agencies are still operating. Dams are still standing. Water is still moving. Power is still being generated. Cities are still functioning. Farms are still producing. But the system is using more of its attention, more of its emergency authority, more of its negotiation capacity, and more of its stored water just to keep familiar functions alive. This is what overload looks like in a managed river. It does not always look like chaos. It looks like constant coordination under shrinking margins. It looks like fewer easy decisions. It looks like every forecast becoming political. The public often waits for a dramatic failure before believing a system has changed. But the Colorado River system is showing a quieter kind of change. The release table changes. The operating guidelines enter a high-stakes rewrite. Reservoirs are managed not only for delivery, but for threshold protection. Hydropower becomes less certain. Upstream reservoirs become drought response tools for downstream infrastructure. The basin states struggle to agree because the physics have made the politics sharper. The river has not produced one simple event. It has produced a pattern in which old tools still work, but only by being used more often, more defensively, and with less spare room. The map shows Powell and Mead as two blue bodies separated by canyon and desert. The system sees them as one paired instrument. Powell protects upper basin storage and Glen Canyon operations. Mead supports lower basin deliveries and Hoover Dam operations. When Powell is protected by holding back water, Mead feels the absence later. When Mead is protected by demanding more release, Powell moves closer to danger. When both are low, every choice becomes a transfer of risk. That is the central pattern of the Colorado River now. The question is not only how much water exists, the question is where the risk is placed. This is also why the future risk will not stay in one season. It will move. It will move into late winter snowpack anxiety, when every storm is weighed against the reservoir charts. It will move into spring runoff updates, when a warm month can erase confidence. It will move into summer power demand, when hydropower weakness overlaps with heat-driven electricity use. It will move into autumn planning, when cities and irrigation districts make decisions for the next year before knowing whether the next winter will repair the damage. It will move into the post-2026 operating rules, because the new rules must decide how to share shortage before the shortage becomes an emergency every year. The risk will also move across geography. It starts in the upper basin as snow and runoff. It gathers at Powell as elevation. It moves through Glen Canyon Dam as power and release capacity. It reaches Mead as storage. It reaches the lower basin as shortage planning. It reaches Mexico through international delivery obligations. It reaches tribes through water rights, infrastructure gaps, and long-delayed access. It reaches cities through conservation and rate planning. It reaches farms through crop choices and irrigation uncertainty. It reaches the grid through replacement power and reduced hydro flexibility. A river that looks like a line on a map is actually a network of dependencies spread across the West. This is why the old preparation calendar is no longer enough. The old calendar treated drought response as something that could be triggered when reservoirs crossed certain lines. The emerging pattern requires preparation before those lines are reached, because by the time a threshold appears, the system may already have spent the options needed to avoid it. If Powell approaches power pool, the release cut has already happened. If Mead approaches a lower shortage tier, conservation negotiations have already become harder. If hydropower weakens, utilities have already begun looking for replacement supply. If a city announces restrictions, the water stress has already traveled through the basin for months or years. Preparation cannot begin at impact. It has to begin at signal. The signal in this case is not only low water, it is a changed operating posture. Reclamation is not merely describing a declining reservoir. It is actively defending an elevation threshold. That difference defines the system pattern. A passive system watches a number fall. An active but stressed system rearranges itself to keep the number from crossing a line. That rearrangement is the story. It shows that the basin still has tools. It also shows that those tools are being used because the old margin is no longer sufficient. There is a temptation to turn this into a simple moral story. Cities versus farms, upper basin versus lower basin, growth versus conservation, hydropower versus ecology, one state versus another. Those conflicts are real, but they are not enough. The river's system pattern is deeper than any one rivalry. It is a mismatch between a fixed set of promises and a changing set of physical conditions. It is a mismatch between infrastructure built for one range of water behavior and a basin increasingly operating near the edges of that range. It is a mismatch between political time, which moves through deadlines and negotiations, and hydrologic time, which moves through snow, soil, heat, runoff, and storage. The post-2026 negotiations are therefore not just about rules. They are about whether the management system can become honest about margin. A rule that divides water without protecting reservoir function will fail operationally. A rule that protects reservoirs without addressing downstream dependence will fail politically. A rule that ignores tribal rights will fail morally and legally. A rule that assumes future hydrology will behave like the past will fail physically. The river is forcing all of those truths into the same room. That is what a system pattern does. It removes the luxury of solving one problem at a time. The most important future question is not whether Lake Powell can be kept above one threshold for 1 year. That question matters, but it is too narrow. The larger question is whether the system can stop arriving at each threshold with so little time left. Can the basin rebuild enough storage to restore real flexibility, or will every dry period require emergency coordination? Can demand be brought closer to dependable supply, or will reservoirs continue acting as overdraft accounts? Can hydropower planning adjust before generation risk becomes a recurring shock? Can legal rules adapt before physics makes them obsolete? Can communities prepare before the official warning becomes lived disruption? This is not a story about the end of the Colorado River. The river is still there. Water still moves. The system still has capacity, expertise, engineering skill, law, conservation tools, and public attention. But the story is about the end of an assumption. The assumption that the next recovery will arrive in time. The assumption that the reservoirs can carry every deficit. The assumption that a power pool threshold is too extreme to shape current decisions. The assumption that water problems can be divided neatly between upstream and downstream. The assumption that old calendars can govern a new basin. That is why the Powell warning matters beyond Powell. It shows where the future may appear first, not as a single catastrophe, but as a repeated tightening of the operating room. A smaller runoff forecast, a lower elevation, a reduced release, a transferred volume from an upstream reservoir, a new rule under pressure before it is even finalized, a negotiation shaped by fear of a number that has not yet been crossed. The system does not need to break all at once to reveal the future. It only needs to show that normal operation now requires abnormal protection. The event is visible as a reservoir level. The pattern is a river civilization, learning that storage, law, power, agriculture, cities, tribes, and ecosystems are all being tested by the same shrinking margin. The old calendar said winter would refill, spring would deliver, summer would spend, and the reservoirs would carry the difference. The new calendar asks a harder question. What happens when winter does not refill enough, spring does not deliver enough, summer spends more, and the reservoirs are already defending their last safe thresholds? That is the system pattern, and before the story can end, one final line has to be drawn between what the evidence proves, what it does not prove, and what the warning is already strong enough to say. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. Lake Powell is not guaranteed to fall below minimum power pool by August. That is not what the official signal says. The Bureau of Reclamation described a projection under a minimum probable inflow scenario, and projections are not fate. They are operating tools. They change when runoff changes, when releases change, when upstream reservoirs contribute water, when conservation changes demand, and when weather shifts the next part of the calendar. That boundary matters because a serious warning becomes weaker when it is turned into a certainty it cannot support. The point is not to say the threshold must be crossed. The point is that the system is already acting because the threshold has become close enough to shape decisions. That is the first evidence line. The risk is real. The outcome is not fixed. The second evidence line is about cause. It would be wrong to say one dry forecast alone explains the entire Colorado River crisis. The river is not under pressure from one variable. It is under pressure from many variables arriving together. Weak runoff matters, low storage matters, heat matters, demand matters, legal promises matter, reservoir operations matter, hydropower thresholds matter, the long drought record matters, the post-2026 rule process matters. None of these factors alone tells the whole story. Together, they describe the machine that is now being tested. This is not just a low reservoir, this is a release margin failure. But even that sentence needs care. It does not mean every downstream problem is caused by one release cut from Lake Powell. It does not mean every farmer, city, tribe, utility, or household will feel the same impact at the same time. The Colorado River moves through contracts, priorities, reservoirs, canals, laws, infrastructure, power systems, and political decisions. Stress is filtered before it becomes personal. Some places are buffered. Some places are exposed. Some users have senior rights. Some communities still lack infrastructure to use water that exists on paper. Some impacts arrive as direct reductions. Others arrive as uncertainty, cost, planning stress, or a narrower future. That is why the evidence must be held with both hands. One hand holds caution, the other holds urgency. Caution says Powell may stay above minimum power pool if interventions work and future hydrology improves. Urgency says the interventions themselves are the signal. Reclamation is not moving water from Flaming Gorge and reducing Powell releases because the system is comfortable. It is doing so to protect a critical elevation. That action is evidence. It says the old margin is too thin for the current risk. It says the reservoir is close enough to a hard operating line that the river's movement has to be changed before the public sees a dramatic failure. The alarm is not only what might happen in August. The alarm is what has already had to happen to reduce the chance of August becoming worse. That is the difference between weather drama and system analysis. A sensational story would say the river is dying tomorrow. That is not accurate. A dismissive story would say there is nothing to see because water is still flowing. That is not accurate either. The truth is more difficult and more important. The Colorado River is still moving, still managed, still serving cities and farms, still generating power, still carrying ecosystems and economies, but it is doing so with less slack, more defensive operations, and a growing dependence on choices that shift stress from one place to another. The event will pass in some form. Every forecast window passes. August will become September. A new study will replace the old study. The next winter will arrive. Reservoir elevations will rise or fall again. Agencies will update the tables. Negotiators will continue working on post-2026 rules. The public may move on when the immediate headline fades, but the thing revealed by this warning will remain. A system built around old recovery assumptions is being tested by a basin that no longer follows the old calendar reliably. That is the future echo. It does not echo as one final collapse. It echoes as repeated threshold defense. Protect Powell, protect Mead, protect hydropower, protect delivery, protect tribes, protect cities, protect farms, protect ecosystems, protect the legal process, protect public trust. Each protection is necessary. Each protection costs something. Each one shows that the river no longer has the room it once appeared to have. Return to the first image. A federal operating signal appears on a dashboard. It names a reservoir, a number, and a month. Lake Powell could fall below 3,490 feet by August without major intervention. At first, that sounds like a lake story. Then the next number appears. 7.48 million acre-feet becomes 6.0 million acre-feet. Suddenly the story changes. The risk is not just water falling behind concrete. It is water being held back because moving it on the old schedule could weaken the very infrastructure that makes the schedule possible. That is the center of the story. The headline is elevation. The hidden signal is release. The deeper mechanism is runoff failure. The human pathway is uncertainty, traveling into work, bills, crops, cities, tribes, and households. The weak point is the narrow place inside Glen Canyon Dam, where water must still be high enough to become power and controlled release. The precedent is a 21st century record of dry years, low inflow, and incomplete recovery. The system pattern is an old river calendar being rewritten under pressure. the evidence does not prove that 1 month will decide the fate of the Colorado River. It does prove something else. It proves that the system is already operating close enough to critical thresholds that forecast uncertainty now becomes policy pressure. It proves that low runoff can move from mountain snowpack into reservoir elevation, from reservoir elevation into dam function, from dam function into release schedules, from release schedules into Lake Mead, and from Lake Mead into the lives and negotiations of the entire basin. It proves that the river's future is not only about how much water exists, but where that water sits when it arrives, and what the infrastructure can still do with it. That last part is easy to miss. Water is not useful in the abstract. It is useful in position. High enough behind a dam, it can generate electricity. Timed correctly through a release, it can support downstream management. Stored in the right reservoir, it can protect a threshold. Delivered at the right moment, it can keep a field alive. Pumped through the right infrastructure, it can reach a community. Recognized through the right legal and physical system, it can become actual access instead of a paper right. The Colorado River crisis is not only a shortage of water, it is a shortage of usable water in the right place at the right time with enough margin to absorb surprise. That is why release cuts are the signal. They reveal that managers are not merely counting what remains. They are deciding what the remaining water is allowed to do. Some water must stay in Powell to protect the power pool. Some water is expected downstream to support Mead. Some water is asked from upstream reservoirs to buy time. Some water is saved through conservation. Some water is argued over in rules that must outlast the current crisis. The river becomes a sequence of trade-offs, and every trade-off leaves a trace. There is no honest ending that turns this into comfort. But there is also no honest ending that turns it into despair. The basin still has choices. Conservation is real. Operating rules can change. Infrastructure can adapt. Demand can be reduced. Power planning can become more resilient. Tribal water rights and infrastructure can be treated with the seriousness they have long been denied. Cities can use less. Agriculture can be supported through transitions that do not pretend farmers are disposable. Agencies can build rules that protect reservoirs before emergencies force harder choices. Wet years can still help. Skilled management can still prevent worse outcomes. But none of those choices work if the system keeps pretending that the old margin is still there. That is the final boundary of evidence. We do not know exactly what Lake Powell will be on every day in August. We do not know the next winter's snowpack. We do not know how every negotiation will end. We do not know which conservation agreements will hold, which legal conflicts will sharpen, or which infrastructure investments will arrive in time. Those are unknowns. What we do know is that the operating signal has already appeared. We know Reclamation identified a pathway where Powell could fall below minimum power pool without intervention. We know the planned release was cut. We know upstream water was used to support Powell. We know Glen Canyon Dam depends on elevation for hydropower. We know Lake Mead depends on Powell's releases. We know the post-2026 rules are being written under the shadow of these conditions. We know the river system is no longer being tested only by drought, but by the loss of recovery time between loads. The warning does not need exaggeration. The evidence is already enough. When the next reservoir chart appears, look at the lake level, but do not stop there. Look at the release. Look at the inflow. Look at the upstream transfers. Look at Mead. Look at the power pool line. Look at the rule calendar. Look at the people whose choices are being narrowed before the public sees the narrowing. That is where the real story lives. Because the future will not be decided only by the lowest number Lake Powell reaches. It will be decided by whether the river system still has enough margin to recover before the next load arrives. A dry year is difficult. A dry year after incomplete recovery is dangerous. A threshold is serious. A threshold that changes behavior before it is crossed is a warning from the machinery itself. So the final image is not an empty lake. It is a control room where the lights remain on, the screens still work, the operators are still calm, and yet every major number is asking for attention at once. Inflow, elevation, release, storage, Power, time. The system has not gone silent. It is speaking clearly. The question is whether the basin will listen while there is still room to choose.